This is Grafted Together with ACSI Chief Ministry Officer Jerry Nelson.
Man, I've been on the road recently and had an opportunity to travel overseas, travel out west. And one of the things that I'm super excited about is the fervency around this topic of spiritual formation. I've come into contact with so many leaders, heads of schools, practitioners who are really excited to dig their teeth into what they believe to be the distinctive of Christian education, and that is spiritual formation. Well, I am so excited about my guest today because there aren't too many people that I've met that has such energy around this topic, and someone who is already putting in the work to connect with other leaders around the country and really help build a network of individuals to bring them together and to share resources and to share expertise around, again, probably the most important thing that we can focus on in Christian education, and that is spiritual formation. This is Grafted Together. Well, I'm pleased to welcome my guest, Josh Leonard, who is the Dean of Spiritual Formation and Discipleship at North Raleigh Christian Academy in Raleigh, North Carolina, a part of the Research Triangle, right, Josh?
That is exactly right, Jerry. This is such a gift for me. It always is when you and I get to sit down and discuss anything really, but especially when it's a topic surrounding spiritual formation. I appreciate you having me on today.
Man, absolutely, man. This is like fire and gasoline, man. It's just a constant explosion of knowledge and inspiration. Well, hey, can you tell our viewers and our listeners a little bit about yourself and, how did God even lead you into this position in the first place?
Yes, it's a great question and a longer story than probably we even have time for here. But the one thing I always knew from the moment the Lord called me into ministry, which took place my second year of college. I was serving at a VBS with some students there, and that was the moment that the Lord spoke to me and called me into a life of full-time ministry, which caused a little bit of shifting in my college days of what I was pursuing academically and more importantly, relationally, the ways that I was living out life in Gainesville, Florida. At that point, I knew very quickly that the Lord had called me into a ministry to students. I didn't really know what that looked like. I didn't know where or what, but I just knew that I had a heart and a passion to see this next generation come to know who they are in Jesus and to the life that He's called them to. So that really spurred on a lot of pursuits of ways to be around students. Sometimes that was in the local church through youth ministry. I did that often, but also in public schools, coaching sports, finding part-time jobs where I got to work alongside students in different capacities, all with just the ultimate pursuit of being able to have conversations with them and get the chance to not only share the gospel with them, but walk alongside them in their pursuit of Christ. And so that was really the moment. Those years were formative years for me in my pursuit of this calling God's given me to serve students.
I remember this just jogged my memory of my former pastor. When God really showed him what was taking place in our local community, but the trend that was happening around the world. Again, he's a longtime pastor, very connected with his denomination. And so he was watching the trends and he came to the realization that, man, the students are coming to the school, because I was a part of a church school type of dynamic. I know that's different than yours, but he came to this early conclusion. There was no research at the time done on this, but he started doing some math and where he said that, the school has the kids more than the church. This is the pastor saying this. And he came to the conclusion that, hey, if we're going to have an impact on this next generation, one of the things that we have an opportunity to do, especially being in a church school situation, is if they're coming to us, let's meet them where they are and do everything that we can to train up this next generation. And so I when I think about your role and your position, you are a part of a trend of folks who started out thinking that maybe they were going to go into full-time church ministry, or in some
Yep.
cases, folks thought they were going to be missionaries. But God is leading a group of individuals into schools. And
Hmm.
it is awesome to see this take place. And I just love to hear your perspective on just the impact and the potential impact that schools can have on the spiritual formation of a child.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when we talk about the spiritual formation of this generation, particularly within the school setting, you're talking about the we use lots of different analogies, right? The three-legged stool, or the three triangles of church, home, and school, and it's important to have all of those in the conversation. I'm sure we'll discuss more of those at length here in this conversation as well. But when we talk about being in Christian education, like you said, we get to see these students. We often talk about the school day, which may span 6 to 7 hours during the day, but so many of them involved in extracurriculars and
Yeah.
sports. We have students who are here 10 plus hours a day, where all of a sudden we're not just in an academic setting, but we're seeing
Mhm.
them involved in their passions and the things that they love. And we get the opportunity to integrate the truths of Scripture and the life that Christ has called us to into those very passions. So not just their learning and their growth and their development process, but we truly get to model what it looks like to live a life in pursuit of Christ as they're learning to live that out and growing throughout their years at school.
Yeah, I love the idea of modeling, and it moves beyond just the head part, which a lot of
Hmm.
times get this. I mean, school gets a lot of head attention, right? The
That's
academic
right.
part, or even down to when we talk about worldview formation, it is apologetics. A lot of times that is in the intellectual realm, or even on the other side about the service. But I really love the whole idea of modeling, because
Hmm.
I think there's a reason that Jesus came down and he dwelt among us,
So
right?
good.
Emmanuel, God with us. And that is to be with us and to set that example for us. And so, you're spending a lot of time with students. And, I've heard it on both ends that, some folks are concerned about this generation. We've
Mm.
obviously heard about, some of the mental health issues that this generation is facing, with the anxiety as well. But I've got to believe there are some positives about this generation. There's got to be some good things, that you're seeing on the ground.
Hmm.
Talk to me about the good that you're seeing in this generation, this crop that the Lord is raising up.
Man, I love these students, and not just students in general, but this generation, I think, and this isn't this is kind of a little bit of a norm even for the cultural current that we're swimming in, right? Where we just begin to categorize groupings of people under a singular umbrella as if they all fit this very specific mold. And man, I love the opportunity when those come up with other people speaking about the generation as a whole, because in my experience, this is a special group
Mhm.
of young people who are very specifically and uniquely designed by God for this moment that we're living in today. For me, I see things in these students where they are so curious, and I love this part about them, right? Where they're not afraid to ask the question why.
Mhm.
Right? These students want to know why something is true. When you and I were growing up here, right? We grew up in a time where if Daddy said it or the Bible said it, it's true. We're
Yeah.
not no
Yeah.
questions asked, right? We're good.
Mhm.
It's a yes, sir, we got it, and we're moving forward in here. And frankly, there's a lot about that caused even myself growing up of like, well, now I'm older and I've got to wrestle with, why do I believe this is true?
Mhm.
And they're asking these very same questions so
Yeah.
much earlier. This is a big part of when we're talking spiritual formation for us here at NRCA. We're not just talking about the what, we're trying to answer the question, why does this
Yeah.
matter?
Yeah.
It's not just why is it true, though that certainly is a huge aspect of it as well, but it's why does this matter for you? Because for them, that's a huge part of their formative thinking. They want to think and wrestle with, how does this apply to my life here?
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge positive for these students, particularly those who are growing up in Christian education, where when they're asking that question, we get to answer it. We get to step in and actually be able to talk about these very topics that they're wrestling with.
Yeah.
Our students, actually, we're walking through right now a school-wide service project where we're partnering with a local Foster Hope of North Carolina, where
Mhm.
we're bringing in materials and things that can be used for children going through transitional care. And this is a huge, huge positive of this generation that I love, is they are ready. They are ready to serve when there is a need. There is such this innate draw to
Yeah.
empathy for the other,
Yeah.
right? There's such this desire for love of neighbor,
Mhm.
and walking through the ways that we can truly love our neighbor is a huge conversation we have often. But man, this generation loves people. We see this time and time again, and they want to step in and serve in these ways. And so for me, it's not even just that we've seen a great amount of generosity here with this service project, but I love seeing the students who have come to me time and time again this week saying, "Can I come after school?" When they could go home and they could be
Yeah.
doing whatever they'd like to do in their free time, but can I serve in getting these things together so that we can give these to them the right way?
Yeah.
We can get it to them as quickly as we can. And so, I think the curiosity, I think the boldness and the willingness to step in are huge, huge parts of this
Yeah.
generation that is going to be a great impact on our society.
Two thoughts come to mind, and I saw this TEDx on YouTube.
Hmm.
It said why 70s kids are the most resilient. And I said, that's interesting. It's like, okay, all right, that's
Hmm.
no problem.
Sure.
But 50 years later, we have kids coming through COVID, and
Hmm.
I surmise that 20 years from now, the kids who are able to walk through this difficult period of the aftermath of COVID,
Yeah.
I think we're actually going to find a lot of resiliency. And of course, with every generation, there's going to be a group that really struggles, really falls away.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're going to find a level of resiliency that is going to be mind-blowing, combined with the empathy that you mentioned. In fact, your comment really supports what the recent three-part Barner study
Mm-hmm.
was done on teens and Jesus, teens in the Bible, and I think teens in impact, where I think it said 22% of the nearly 26,000 students or 13 to 17-year-olds around the world said that they were Jesus committed. So they were kind of like at the highest level. And then, it went down there to the next one at 8%, only 8% of that 26,000 was Bible engaged. So that obviously
Mm-hmm.
presents another opportunity, in the spiritual formation realm. But
Definitely.
the highest, 24% of the nearly 26,000 13 to 17-year-old teens that were surveyed, 24% justice oriented. And so
Mm-hmm.
what you just shared, I mean, that's what the Barna survey picked up, several years ago. But let's pivot really quickly to
Yeah.
parents.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's some positive with the students. I'm not even going to ask about positives or negatives about parents. I just want to hear your perspective on parents in this generation, what you're seeing on the ground.
Yeah, this is it's a great question. I'm a dad myself of three younger children. So our oldest is 6 and is in first grade, and then our two boys are 4 and just about 20 months. And so we're in kind of that early stage
Yeah.
of parenting. We're kind of navigating that younger stage there, and then. obviously I get the opportunity to serve alongside parents of all ages here in this role. And I would say, there's a number of things that are incredibly, I mean, we won't, not necessarily positive and negative, but there's something that I think in this instance when talking about parents that is fascinating to me is just kind of the parental foundation or techniques in parenting that are used in this generation compared to when I look at my own experience with my parents or growing up with my friends' parents.
Mhm.
This is statistically, I think we find often when these polls are taken that there's a high majority that of parents in this age that have moved toward what is called gentle parenting,
Yeah.
right? It's this relational parenting where you're walking through circumstances with your children, and oftentimes that means there's the gentle parenting comes with less punishments, right, or less threats
Mhm.
there in that way. This gentle parenting tactic here, I actually think has provided an opportunity for parents to engage their children in a way that maybe prior generations didn't get that chance to. Similar to what I just said, right? If
Yeah.
daddy said it, it was right. It's
Yeah.
a yes. And that's not to say that that is the incorrect way to parent. Certainly not. And there's certainly nuance to this conversation. But I think when we talk about this generation of students, there is an element where being willing to step into a moment with these students and to
Mhm.
step into a conversation and actually listen first
Yeah.
and then respond after
Interesting.
gives you margin in the life of these students. They appreciate the opportunity to wrestle out loud with the things that they're walking through, even if it's poor decisions. I
Yeah.
find many students come and sit in my office here, and I don't start out with the here's this and here's that and let's keep it moving. I want to hear exactly how they arrived where they are, because oftentimes that provides me an opportunity to listen for the voice of the Spirit
Yeah.
on, okay, what's the biblical wisdom for this student? Same circumstance, two different students, that response may be different,
Yeah.
right? And this student may respond much better to this very specific direction. This
Yeah.
student may respond better to a more conversational approach here.
Yeah.
And I think the willingness of parents in this generation to step into those moments and engage in that way has actually given them opportunities to have that dialogue and to keep that conversation open, because we know they're swimming in a cultural current where there is not a lack of voices for
Yeah.
them to find.
That's
If they
good.
want to find somebody to tell them what they want to hear, they will find that person. If they hold a cell phone in their pocket, they can find somebody to affirm what it is that they want to hear. So we want the opportunity
Yeah.
to dialogue with our students. We want to have this open engagement with our children. And I do think that's the millennial parents that are
Yeah.
stepping into this generation have done that well in some ways. And I also think that's not to say that there isn't a need for consequences. I don't want to be misheard in that way. There are
Yeah.
certainly consequences to actions and moments for those as well. But I think that's been a positive that I've seen for students who have great relationships with their parents and are able to dialogue through the things that they're wrestling with.
Yeah, and that's super encouraging. I think, a theme that I'm hearing is this whole idea of really being intentional about the relationships,
Mhm.
really trying to, listen first. And I love what you said about listening to the spirit. And and it seems like in our culture where I know a part of the anxiety still exists, especially those of us who live in America, there's still this anxiety that surrounds progress.
Mhm.
And a lot of times progress means you can't slow down. It means you need
Mhm.
to keep going, you need to keep moving forward.
That's
But
so
based
good.
on what I'm hearing from you is, you know, again, not that we don't have to slow down, but it's we need to make the most of the opportunities that we have and be willing to, just like Jesus at times, to pause, to take a detour, to have a
Mhm.
conversation, especially if we know that it's going to have a significant kingdom impact. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, man, I'm glad you shot that back over to me because you're just like we talked about this in preparation for this meeting and for this podcast episode, and I said this to you then, and I'll repeat it now here. I feel like every conversational topic here that we often have could be its own episode here.
Absolutely.
I I do believe if there's one thing about the parenting in this generation for students, and actually I would even go as far as to say not just parenting, but also even within the Christian education school system,
Yeah.
the pace of our life is having a direct impact in
Mhm.
our ability to invest in this generation.
Yeah.
The pace that we're running at, even when it comes to filling out our school calendar, when it comes to what it looks
Right.
like to walk through our weekends and our home life calendar, is directly impacting the opportunities to do exactly what you just said,
Yeah.
to slow down and to engage our students in the things that they're wrestling with.
Yeah.
Because here's the truth of it in practical, just everyday life, right? You've got everything in your calendar from athletic games,
Hmm.
club sports, school projects, homework, family trips. We've got everything that can fill the calendar in there. And then there's these little pocket moments throughout our day that we're going to fill with something.
Yeah.
And for us as parents, I think we can get, and even as school administrators and educators, we can get so focused on all of those big things within the calendar that we miss the little moments. The little moments sometimes become the moments where we numb ourselves, where we escape
Yeah.
into our own
Yeah.
phones, where we escape into just a moment of rest. Not that rest is bad, right?
Right.
But we escape out of the moment rather than stepping into an opportunity for
Right.
a conversation outside of this normal flow of schedule. And I'll say this here when I talk with parents and even with staff members here at NRCA, one of the biggest things about this generation when it comes to the adults, the coaches, the parents, the mentors in their life is that they are always watching us.
Mm.
They're always watching what it is that we're doing. They're listening, even though sometimes it feels like they are not, right? They are
Yeah.
actually listening to the things that we're saying, but perhaps even more so they're watching how we spend our time.
Yeah.
They're watching what it is
Mm.
that we prioritize in our calendars. They're watching what it is we prioritize with our finances. They're
Mm.
watching how we respond in moments of stress. They're watching how we speak about others in moments when there seems to be this conflict.
Mm.
And I don't say that in this realm of trying to communicate that we should ensure that we are perfect because we
Yeah.
certainly cannot
Yeah.
be, right? And I always bring that up because I actually think that's sometimes one of the places we fall short
Mm.
in the way that we invest in young people is that we are trying so hard to portray this idealized version of perfection in life
Yeah.
when what it is that we're actually communicating to young people that, okay, this is what you need to strive for: constant
Mhm.
achievement and a mask of perfection so that nobody knows
Yeah.
what it is you might be struggling with in
Yeah.
that moment.
Yeah.
When in actuality, the moments we inevitably fail give us an opportunity to, again, model for these young people what it looks like to pursue forgiveness, to be
Yeah.
humble in our pursuit of reconciliation, and in those moments, we actually get to model the life that Christ has called us to,
Absolutely.
as opposed to trying to make it seem like we've got it all together.
Yeah. Man, excellent thought. And I think what you're highlighting is the this impression that somehow just because the kids might have their heads buried in their screens all the time,
Mhm.
that they're not paying attention, but your experience has shown that they're actually really watching.
They absolutely are.
And so and then the other thought that came to my mind, how important it is for everyone to be authentic, like, and of course that authenticity really flows out of each and every Christian school practitioner, leader, teacher,
Mhm.
what have you, coach, etc., having an authentic relationship with Jesus Christ, because that's the only way
Mhm.
that you become that authentic person that I think that the kids, because both you and I know, I mean, we grew up in youth ministry.
Yep.
We knew the people who were authentic,
Yep.
and we knew the people who were not.
Yes. That has not changed in this next generation. And in fact, it might even be that they are even more aware
Yeah.
of those things because they see so much. There's so much opportunity to see different types of people in different avenues here, and they know what's a show. They know what is this authentic display of what your heart is, and they are drawn to that personal relational authenticity of life, and that's who they want to hear from. They want to hear from those whom they are familiar with in a way that they believe them to be genuine in
Right.
what they're sharing.
Yeah, no, that's so good. And so I want to pivot lastly to spiritual life directors. And as I said
Mm,
at the top, I'm super encouraged by the fact that heads of schools, and not that they're abdicating their responsibility to be the overarching spiritual leader of the school,
right.
but they're recognizing that we are in a different paradigm, and it may have been inadvertent that Christian schools have had a little drift over the
Mhm.
years, started emphasizing things maybe they should not have, but I am genuinely seeing the course correction. And as the
Mhm.
scriptures say, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. And to see heads of schools allocating money, and not just the money, but putting leaders in positions of authority who bear the title of spiritual life director or spiritual formation director or director of discipleship, and giving them authority in the highest levels of the organizational decision making has been super encouraging.
Mhm.
But the other part of this is there isn't a whole lot of track record for this as
Mhm.
well. I mean, it's a relatively new position. And I would say, Josh, you're the old guard now, being in your position.
That's wild to hear.
You're part of the old guard. And maybe
Mhm.
there's a school out there that has a 15, 20-year discipleship director, spiritual formation director, but most of the individuals that I've been talking to, they've just got installed into their position a year ago. Maybe they've been in it for a couple of years, and they're
Mhm.
trying to ask, okay, so what do I do now? This isn't church.
Yes.
So, what advice would you give to spiritual life directors coming on, in newly minted into this position? So that would be my first question. What advice would you give to them?
Yes. I praise the Lord for the movement in this direction. And I've gotten to have a number of conversations with spiritual life directors across the country over the last couple of years, especially. And it has been so encouraging for me to see that and to just hear a little bit of what the Lord's doing in different areas around the country, even around the world, through Christian educators and those serving in these roles. I think there's a number of practical things I would start with in advice to spiritual life directors, but I might use this analogy here. It's something I've been wrestling with all year long. It's
Mm,
been, and maybe wrestling with might not even be the right word, but typically year to year, I pick a word or a phrase that I just kind of sit in throughout the year, right? It's just one I continually go back to in my quiet time, in my message preparations. And this one was actually a quote that I took from a book called Made for People. Justin Early wrote this book. He
mm,
came out and spoke with our parents a few years ago as a fantastic writer and speaker on community and discipleship of children, actually within the parenting space. But he said this phrase where he said, as Christians, we are called to use the creative power of words to build redemptive realities.
mm,
And when I read that, it immediately struck a chord with me and has not left me since. And it's been a long time since I've read it. And I think the reason is because when I think about my role overseeing spiritual formation and discipleship here at NRCA, there's a lot about that phrase that rings true, that there's a lot about this role and this calling where I am seeking to use the creative power of words to rebuild redemptive realities for our students, and oftentimes even for our staff members, where we are fighting this cultural push that's coming in on our students every time they leave our hallways, even our staff members who are serving nonstop constantly. And there's just this picture. I'll try not to use multiple analogies, but I'm gonna use a second one here because I think it paints the picture. That I'm reading a book now by Jeff Bethke and John Tyson called Fighting Shadows, working through it with a group of guys at our church. And he uses this analogy of like an eclipse, right? That these lies begin to eclipse our view of God, where we find ourselves living in the shadows. And I think for me, when I first heard that, when I first read it, I saw myself as one who could recognize the shadow and also justify that I have enough light, right? There's still a little bit of light. We've still got some good over here. And I think that that's a space that we find a lot of our students in and a lot of our staff members. I think if you are talking to any human being, you probably are finding somebody who is sitting in a place where there are these lies, struggles, or frustrations that are eclipsing their view of the full glory of God. And so for me, in whatever we're doing, there's infinite practical things that we could talk about on how to navigate chapels and discipleship and community service and mission trips between the church and the Christian school. Lots of conversations. But the foundation of all of those things for me is, how can I take this moment, this circumstance, this event, and begin to shine a light for our students and our staff members on the actual purpose of who they are, of who they've been designed to be, that God has created you in his image, that he loves you to the depths of your core, and because he knows you more than anyone has ever known you. And still that love is unconditional, right? And so for me, a lot about that role is approaching each situation, each circumstance with drawing our attention back to our Creator. Can we pull ourselves out of the shadows back into the fullness of light?
That's really good. And it reminds me of two of Jesus's most famous dialogues, or monologues in the case of of his commentary on the vine, right? He talks about, like, his desire is that we bear fruit to bring glory to the Father, right? And then, and of course, in the high priestly prayer, just 2 chapters later in the book of John, and it's like, his prayer is that we would all be one as he and the Father are one, ultimately bringing glory to the Father. And what I hear is the spiritual life director needs to see their position as the heralds of God's glory and the goodness and the great potential of humanity when it is under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Am I hearing that correctly, Josh?
You are, and I think that's beautifully said, and I think to kind of interweave that with maybe even some practical aspects of what that looks like in our current moment is I think that while that's the foundational part of this role, right? It's foundational that in everything we're doing, we're seeking to ensure that we are following the direction of the Spirit, and we're being intentional in our words, in the ways that we're making much of Jesus in everything that we do. With that being said, I think some of the other aspects of this role would include this hyper intentionality for these spiritual life directors to know their students, right? To know their staff members, to be physically present in the hallways, at the athletic events, in the fine arts events. I often tell people, I'm here first thing in the morning with everybody, but my day often starts at 3 o'clock as
Mm,
soon as the bell rings, because that's when students are in the hallways, they're out of the classroom. And of course, there are things happening where I'm meeting with students during the day. But those are the moments where I get to organically be where they want to be.
yeah.
They want to be at practice. They want to be in the hallways with their friends. And I get to step into that space and get to talk with them in a way that's far more relational and organic, to begin building that margin to hopefully, and oftentimes it doesn't take very long, to get an opportunity to speak
Yeah.
into something that they're wrestling with. And then it calls back to even what we said a little bit before about, in those moments, what does it look like to listen first
Yeah.
and listen often before ever responding? Because it's not a matter of just like, okay, here's your token wisdom. It's, how can I know this student enough to be able to actually speak into a moment of their life?
Mm,
And I probably would, and I would certainly be remiss if I didn't say this here, that one of the first pieces of advice I often give spiritual life directors is, regardless of your size of school, whatever school it is you're serving in, you can't do it alone.
yeah.
There
Yeah.
is no single person on
Yeah.
the planet who has the bandwidth to be this discipler of each of these students, and to be present in every moment when it's necessary. And so for that, I often say, don't forget your teachers, your fellow administrators, the
Mhm.
staff that you have. I wrote this year for our in-service, our head of school, Dr. Mathis, he was gracious to allow me to take a little bit of our in-service time where I just wrote a period of solitude for our staff members, where it was just kind of a guided walkthrough of a passage of scripture and some reflective questions and time of prayer.
Good.
And it wasn't meant for educational purposes. It wasn't meant to be used in the classroom. It wasn't even meant specifically for educators. It
Yeah.
was simply meant for image bearers who have
I
been
love it.
called to a specific place of worship and work.
Yeah.
And how can we do that while we're seeking the voice of the Spirit in everything that we're doing?
Well, Josh, man, we can probably go, we can have one of those Pauline moments where we're up all night long, man.
I've,
Just make
I've
sure you
got the
come
time. You
up.
just let me make some coffee.
Well, hey, listen, I know, man, this has been awesome, and you're full of practical wisdom as well, in addition to having that theological foundation. Can you tell our listeners about some of the stuff that you're doing in the NRCA, especially related to parents? You have a podcast that you do for your parents. Can you talk a little bit about that?
We do. This was one of those moments where we recognized our demographic, our parents, our families, and we want to be the most helpful resource for our parents in their role as disciplers of their children. And so for us, we recognize that for many of our parents, having a podcast that they can listen to when they are on their commute to work, or for many of them, we have found with their students in the car, at home, that begins to engage conversation, they would love that. And so last year we started what we call the Rooted Rhythms podcast, where essentially the design is much like this one. We take a topic each month, and we bring in different voices from across the world to speak into each of those topics, not in a way that's meant to be exhaustive, not in a way that's meant to give all the answers, because certainly we could never do that,
Yeah.
but simply in a way that would hopefully spur us into deeper thought
Mm.
and contemplation, and hopefully conversation with those in our small groups at churches, those underneath the roofs of our home. Just ability to use that content to engage in further conversations of ways to best engage this generation and live the life that Christ has called us to.
And so if our listeners wanted to get access to your Rooted Rhythm podcast, where might they find it?
We are available anywhere that you can find podcasts: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all places available. It is the Rooted Rhythms podcast there, and all episodes there, season 1 from last year. And we are a few episodes into season 2 at this point, with the next one dropping here in the next couple of weeks.
Awesome, awesome. Josh, man, God bless you, man. It's great to know you and folks like you who are stepping into this space full of the Spirit and with a clear vision for what God has called you to do. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Jerry, appreciate you, brother.
Grafted Together is a presentation of the Association of Christian Schools International. Learn more about biblical worldview and spiritual formation at acsi.org/graftedtogether.